Chapter 63 of Nicholas Nickleby, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Nicholas Nickleby, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 63. The brothers Cheeryble make various declarations for themselves and others. Tim Linkinwater makes a declaration for himself. Some weeks had passed, and the first shock of these events had subsided. Madeline had been removed, Frank had been absent, and Nicholas and Kate had begun to try in good earnest to stifle their own regrets, and to live for each other and for their mother, who, poor lady, could in no wise be reconciled to this dull and altered state of affairs, when there came one evening, per favour of Mr. Linkinwater, an invitation from the brothers to dinner on the next day but one, comprehending not only Mrs. Nickleby, Kate, and Nicholas, but little Miss La Creevy, who was most particularly mentioned. "Now, my dears," said Mrs. Nickleby, when they had rendered becoming honour to the bidding, and Tim had taken his departure, "what does this mean?" "What do you mean, mother?" asked Nicholas, smiling. "I say, my dear," rejoined that lady, with a face of unfathomable mystery, "what does this invitation to dinner mean? What is its intention and object?" "I conclude it means, that on such a day we are to eat and drink in their house, and that its intent and object is to confer pleasure upon us," said Nicholas. "And that's all you conclude, is it, my dear?" "I have not yet arrived at anything deeper, mother." "Then I'll just tell you one thing," said Mrs. Nickleby. "You'll find yourself a little surprised, that's all. You may depend upon it that this means something besides dinner." "Tea and supper, perhaps," suggested Nicholas. "I wouldn't be absurd, my dear, if I were you," replied Mrs. Nickleby, in a lofty manner, "because it's not by any means becoming, and doesn't suit you at all. What I mean to say is, that the Mr. Cheerybles don't ask us to dinner with all this ceremony for nothing. Never mind, wait and see. You won't believe anything I say, of course. It's much better to wait, a great deal better. It's satisfactory to all parties, and there can be no disputing. All I say is, remember what I say now, and when I say I said so, don't say I didn't." With this stipulation, Mrs. Nickleby, who was troubled night and day with a vision of a hot messenger tearing up to the door to announce that Nicholas had been taken into partnership, quitted that branch of the subject, and entered upon a new one. "It's a very extraordinary thing," she said, "a most extraordinary thing, that they should have invited Miss La Creevy. It quite astonishes me, upon my word it does. Of course it's very pleasant that she should be invited, very pleasant, and I have no doubt that she'll conduct herself extremely well. She always does. It's very gratifying to think that we should have been the means of introducing her into such society, and I'm quite glad of it, quite rejoiced, for she certainly is an exceedingly well-behaved and good-natured little person. I could wish that some friend would mention to her how very badly she has her cap trimmed, and what very preposterous bows those are, but of course that's impossible, and if she likes to make a fright of herself, no doubt she has a perfect right to do so. We never see ourselves, never do, and never did, and I suppose we never shall." This moral reflection reminding her of the necessity of being peculiarly smart on the occasion, so as to counterbalance Miss La Creevy, and be herself an effectual set-off and atonement, led Mrs. Nickleby into a consultation with her daughter relative to certain ribbons, gloves, and trimmings, which being a complicated question, and one of paramount importance, soon routed the previous one, and put it to flight. The great day arriving, the good lady put herself under Kate's hands an hour or so after breakfast, and dressing by easy stages, completed her toilet in sufficient time to allow of her daughter's making hers, which was very simple and not very long, though so satisfactory that she had never appeared more charming or looked more lovely. Miss La Creevy, too, arrived with 2 bandboxes, whereof the bottoms fell out as they were handed from the coach, and something in a newspaper, which a gentleman had sat upon coming down, and which was obliged to be ironed again before it was fit for service. At last everybody was dressed, including Nicholas, who had come home to fetch them, and they went away in a coach sent by the brothers for the purpose. Mrs. Nickleby wondering very much what they would have for dinner, and cross-examining Nicholas as to the extent of his discoveries in the morning, whether he had smelt anything cooking at all like turtle, and if not, what he had smelt, and diversifying the conversation with reminiscences of dinners to which she had gone some 20 years ago, concerning which she particularized not only the dishes but the guests, in whom her hearers did not feel a very absorbing interest, as not one of them had ever chanced to hear their names before. The old butler received them with profound respect and many smiles, and ushered them into the drawing room, where they were received by the brothers with so much cordiality and kindness that Mrs. Nickleby was quite in a flutter, and had scarcely presence of mind enough even to patronize Miss La Creevy. Kate was still more affected by the reception, for knowing that the brothers were acquainted with all that had passed between her and Frank, she felt her position a most delicate and trying one, and was trembling on the arm of Nicholas, when Mr. Charles took her in his, and led her to another part of the room. 'Have you seen Madeline, my dear,' he said, 'since she left your house?' 'No, sir,' replied Kate, 'not once.' 'And not heard from her, Not heard from her?' 'I have only had one letter,' rejoined Kate, gently. 'I thought she would not have forgotten me quite so soon.' 'Ah!' said the old man, patting her on the head, and speaking as affectionately as if she had been his favourite child. 'Poor dear! What do you think of this, brother Ned? Madeline has only written to her only once, Ned, and she didn't think she would have forgotten her quite so soon, Ned.' 'Oh, sad, sad, very sad!' said Ned. The brothers interchanged a glance, and looking at Kate for a little time without speaking, shook hands, and nodded as if they were congratulating each other on something very delightful. 'Well, well,' said brother Charles, 'go into that room, my dear, that door yonder, and see if there's not a letter for you from her. I think there's one upon the table. You needn't hurry back, my love, if there is, for we don't dine just yet, and there's plenty of time, plenty of time.' Kate retired as she was directed. Brother Charles, having followed her graceful figure with his eyes, turned to Mrs. Nickleby and said, 'We took the liberty of naming 1 hour before the real dinner time, ma'am, because we had a little business to speak about, which would occupy the interval. Ned, my dear fellow, will you mention what we agreed upon? Mr. Nickleby, sir, have the goodness to follow me.' Without any further explanation, Mrs. Nickleby, Miss La Creevy, and brother Ned were left alone together, and Nicholas followed brother Charles into his private room, where, to his great astonishment, he encountered Frank, whom he supposed to be abroad. 'Young men,' said Mr. Cheeryble, 'shake hands.' 'I need no bidding to do that,' said Nicholas, extending his. 'Nor I,' rejoined Frank, and he clasped it heartily. The old gentleman thought that 2 handsomer or finer young fellows could scarcely stand side by side than those on whom he looked with so much pleasure. Suffering his eyes to rest upon them, for a short time in silence, he said while he seated himself at his desk, 'I wish to see you friends, close and firm friends, and if I thought you otherwise, I should hesitate in what I am about to say. Frank, look here. Mr. Nickleby, will you come on the other side?' The young men stepped up on either hand of brother Charles, who produced a paper from his desk, and unfolded it. 'This,' he said, 'is a copy of the will of Madeline's maternal grandfather, bequeathing her the sum of £12,000, payable either upon her coming of age or marrying. It would appear that this gentleman, angry with her, his only relation, because she would not put herself under his protection and detach herself from the society of her father, in compliance with his repeated overtures, made a will leaving this property, which was all he possessed, to a charitable institution. He would seem to have repented this determination, however, for 3 weeks afterwards, and in the same month, he executed this. By some fraud it was abstracted immediately after his decease, and the other, the only will found, was proved and administered. Friendly negotiations, which have only just now terminated, have been proceeding since this instrument came into our hands, and as there is no doubt of its authenticity, and the witnesses have been discovered, after some trouble, the money has been refunded. Madeline has therefore obtained her right, and is, or will be, when either of the contingencies which I have mentioned has arisen, mistress of this fortune. You understand me?' Frank replied in the affirmative. Nicholas, who could not trust